Mr. Bump Loses His Memory by Roger Hargreaves. Read by Books for Kids by Flying Dragons. Mr. Bump is the sort of person who is always having accidents. Small accidents, medium-sized accidents, and big accidents. Lots and lots of accidents. One day, Mr. Bump got out of bed, or rather, he fell out of bed, as he did every morning. He drew back the curtains and opened the window. It was a beautiful day. He leant on the windowsill and breathed in deeply and fell out of the window. Bump! Mr. Bump sat up and rubbed his head, and as he rubbed, it dawned on him that he had no idea where he was. He had no idea whose garden he was sitting in.
He was sitting in his flower's garden.
Oh, he had no idea whose house he was sitting in front of.
He was sitting in front of his house.
Oh, and he had no idea who he was.
Mr. Bump.
Mr. Bump had lost his memory. Mr. Bump walked up to his garden gate and looked down the lane. Mr. Muddle was passing by. "Good afternoon," said Mr. Muddle. As you and I know, it was morning, but Mr. Muddle, not surprisingly, always gets things in a muddle. "I seem to have lost my memory," said Mr. Bump. "Do you know what my name is?" "You're Mr. Careful," said Mr. Muddle. "Thank you," said Mr. Bump. Mr. Bump went into town. The first person he met was Mrs. Packet, the grocer, carrying an armful of groceries. "Hello," said Mr. Bump. "I'm Mr. Careful. Can I help?" "Just the person. I need someone careful to deliver these eggs." Mr. Bump took the eggs from Mrs. Packet and set off down the high street. And because he was Mr. Bump, he slipped and fell on the eggs, breaking all of them. "You're not all that careful, are you?" said Mrs. Packet. "Sorry," said Mr. Bump. He walked on past the dairy. Mr. Bottle, the manager, came out. "I'm looking for someone to drive the milk float," he said. "What's your name?" "Mr. Careful," replied Mr. Bump. "Perfect," said Mr. Bottle. "I need someone careful to do the milk round." Mr. Bump set off down the road. As he rounded the corner, he hit the curb, and the milk float turned over, smashing all the milk bottles. "Well, that wasn't very carefully done, was it?" said Mr. Bottle. "Sorry," said Mr. Bump. Then he met Mr. Brush the painter, who was up a ladder, painting. "Hello," said Mr. Bump. "I'm Mr. Careful. Do you need a hand?" "Yes, please," replied Mr. Brush. "I need someone careful to pass me that paint pot." Mr. Bump began to climb the ladder. And being Mr. Bump, he fell off and the pot of paint landed on his head. Mr. Bump went for a walk. "Don't understand it," he said to himself. "My name is Mr. Careful, but I can't do anything carefully." It was then that he walked into a tree, bump, and bumped his head. An apple fell out of the tree into his hand. "That's odd," he said to himself. "How did I get here? The last thing I remember is opening my bedroom window. And where did all this paint come from? You know, don't you?" Just at that moment, Farmer Fields turned up. "Careful," he called. "That sounds familiar," said Mr. Bump, and fell down the bank into the river. If you enjoyed this book, please do hit subscribe. We've got lots more Mr. Men books we'd love to share with you, and lots of other books too.